Can I get just a collective sigh of relief that the election is over? I actually don't sigh yet because my opening illustration has to deal with something from the election, so no. Sorry, just suckered into that. I'll put this on just a little bit there. No, it is interesting. It was tremendous drama, and as much of a train wreck as it has been leading up to all of it, I think Tuesday, I think the numbers of viewers that they had watching the election probably set records, multiple channels having high viewership because people were kind of wanting to see how is this finally going to play out. And then, of course, after it played out, there was such surprise and such, how did this happen? And we didn't see this coming based on some of the polls and the things that had been reported. But yet there had been a few who had written the previous week that the polls might not be as accurate as they had thought, and so wondering what we would see. Part of that being something called the hidden votes, which they were trying to explain later. And there was a discrepancy as they were doing the polls, and this is a guy who wrote in October about this, just tracking numbers week to week, month to month, that there were online polls, and then there were the voice, they would call and do the polling over the phone. And that there was a discrepancy in those due to probably people who online would be more honest, people over the phone or in person not being as honest or unsure because of possible repercussions or feeling judged about who they may vote for or whatever, and so that may have skewed the numbers. And then there were people who just didn't know until they finally went out and did it. But it was interesting, these hidden votes based on shame, in a sense, of either one candidate or the other. And that played out when they finally went to vote, found out who they were voting for, anonymously or whatever, but the numbers. And I thought, wow, as I was thinking about this morning, and I came across that, it was this morning we're talking about this idea of shame as a Christian. And going, these hidden votes that politically people feel maybe, I don't want to let people know this because I'm afraid of what they would feel towards me. And thinking, how is that for us as Christians? When we get into places in a culture that's becoming more and more anti-Christian, more and more politically correct, where you have to really kind of dance around what you can or cannot say, what you can or cannot do, does that have an effect on us? Do we become kind of a hidden vote, a hidden voice among Christians? And so this morning I want to look at 2 Timothy chapter 1, because it's something that Paul was dealing with and now passing on to Timothy, this idea of shame, or this potential of shame that's out there that can limit the voice of the Christian, limit the giftedness and the effectiveness of the Christian. And so Paul, he's writing from prison. This is his last stint in prison, and it's about 67 AD when he writes this. And 2 Timothy and Titus are kind of the most personal of the Pauline epistles. 1 Timothy he had written probably about 8 years prior to Timothy, and Timothy was kind of heading up some of the churches in Ephesus, so he had this responsibility. But now in 2 Timothy, Paul is not far from being beheaded, and this is his last letter. And he writes this letter to Timothy that's among the epistles deeply personal. And so the situation, Paul's in prison. Well, a couple years before, Nero had burned Rome and blamed it on the Christians. And so there was persecution now beginning to happen. And so Timothy is in this situation where, Paul, his mentor, is in prison, doesn't know if he's going to get out again. There's more of a pressure in the kingdom from Rome. It's just not as well liked. For a while, Christianity was just kind of seen as a sect of Judaism, and so it was tolerated and allowed. But now things are beginning to maybe change. And then Timothy has these pressures just from in the church and from the culture around and just the people. And we find out that Timothy, if you kind of look into his life and who he is, he's not the boldest of guys. He's more like me. I'm pretty insecure at times. And I look at Timothy and I go, man, Paul is this hero. You go, man, is he shaken at all? Paul is just this icon and just bastion of just presenting the faith and strength and perseverance. And here comes persecution, no problem. Flog me, throw me, leave me for dead, you know. And you kind of look at Paul and go, man, if I could just be like that. But I'm a little more like Timothy. What do we know of Timothy? Well, in 1 Timothy 4, we know that Paul writes, Timothy, hey, let no one look down on your youthfulness, but rather through your speech, conduct, your love, faith, and purity, show yourself an example. That Timothy was young in the church, and so there was this tendency that maybe either he was being looked down upon or feeling the pressure of that and kind of acquiescing in shame. In 1 Corinthians 16, kind of in Paul's final words there, he says, Timothy is going to be coming through. Put him at ease. He's been serving in ministry, and don't let anybody despise him. Paul's almost looking out for him. Take care of Timothy. He's tender, but he's still doing the work. And so now we get into 2 Timothy, and there's this idea that's brought forth in the shame 3 times in chapter 1. Verse 8 says, therefore, do not be ashamed. In verse 12, Paul says, but I am not ashamed, for I know whom I've believed, and I'm convinced that he is able to guard until the day what has been entrusted to me. I'm not ashamed, Paul says. But then he says, there were others in verse 16 who had deserted him, but then Onesiphorus refreshed Paul and was not ashamed of Paul. And so there's this kind of idea of shame. When you think about it as we go through, like I said, the world we're in, how do you respond? Are you more like a Paul? Some of you are. Bold, you're able to draw a line, and then others, you do so for a while, but you can kind of feel the crumbling as the pressures hit, that maybe you're not as strong as you wish you were or you used to be. And then others be like, man, I just wish I was stronger in that. How do we stay strong and not have this idea of shame? Well, Paul writes, he says in verse 5, start with, as he's writing this letter, he says, I am reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I am sure dwells in you as well. It says, I am reminded of this faith of yours that is sincere. It is anu hypocrites. It's a word that means not hypocritical, does not have a mask. It's a sincere, genuine faith that you have, but also you've got a lineage. He's saying, your grandmother, your mother, and this faith you have. Find out in Acts that Paul, or Luke writing about Paul going to Lystra and Derbe, and they talk about their encounter there with the family. He says, Paul came also to Derbe and Lystra, and a disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers there. So he had a good reputation when Paul meets him. He was already a believer, and sometimes we see that Paul refers to him as his son. It's not necessarily that Paul was the one who led him to Christ, but that he was already a believer, but Paul took him in and mentored him and discipled him and challenged him and taught him in ministry and commissioned him. And so he was like a spiritual son in that regard. But Timothy was already a believer. Through his mom, through his grandmother. His father was not. And he's like, this faith you have, thinking, being reminded of where it came from and how sincere and true it is. You think about your faith, and you think, if we all stood up and shared our testimony and said, hey, you got 30 seconds. Tell us how you came to know Jesus. 30 seconds, we could probably be out of here by lunch, but what an encouragement it would be if we heard everybody's. I was at this place. I was this old. I had been here. I'd been at Vacation Bible School. I was in the gutter. I was looking my own way. What collection of testimonies would we have here of what God has done? And so Paul, in a sense, reminding him, remember your conversion. Remember what it was like before Christ. What was your life like before you knew? And maybe you were young and a child, and you kind of, well, I don't know that I had this drastic change. And then you've come to a point where you go, well, what would that be? You believed early on. Think of what it would be had you not believed. Where is life? Paul says, but by the grace of God, there would be I. That there can be paths that your life goes, and the grace of God taking you. You remember when it sunk in that this was all new? You remember your first Christmas, singing Christmas hymns as a believer? That maybe you'd sung them over, a bunch of times before, but then as you started really singing the ones that were exalting Christ and His work and the salvation that had come, you thought, gosh, this is real, that this second person of the Trinity, Jesus, came as a baby to live, do life of ministry, serve, and give His life for me. I remember I was being a hypocrite in a sense. I had kind of a background. Our family church attendance was nothing stellar. We hit the major holidays and kind of a few in between. And then if you had to fight the crowds at lunch, then we'd just skip it all together so we could get there early. But we would hit, and it was enough to kind of put this idea, at least, that this is what we do, that there is a God. But there was kind of this thought, well, since I'm American and I'm not Buddhist, I guess I'm a Christian. And yet I remember going through and just kind of faking this life, trying to impress people, putting forth what I wanted people to think I was, and inside having no peace at all in my life because I was pretending. I was trying to be something I wasn't. I was trying to, whatever group, chameleon, to be, and wrestling on the inside. And it was a youth trip that somebody invited a bunch of us to. I didn't know how to ski. I was going to learn to ski. It was going to be awesome. And they're all going, sign me up. And so I went, and everything that I knew in my head all of a sudden started to tear my heart because I realized these people are living so free. There's something genuine. There's a peace. They don't have to pretend. They're not trying to be cool. They're not trying to do whatever it is. And it was like at that point really realizing, what does it mean that Christ has died for me and wants my life? Is it worth it to give it to Him? And my life was totally changed from that moment on. And thinking, gosh, it changed friendships, it changed different things over time. But I look back and I think of the people in my life that led to that point. And for some of you, maybe it was a process. Certain people influencing you, sowing seed, watering it. And then some people have you come to that immediate point where you go, no, I can tell you the day and the hour. Remember your conversion. Remember what God has done in your life. We're not just a cultural group that we're Christians, let's go do this Christian thing. We have been redeemed. We've been transformed. Christ is risen. He is real. Our life is changed. We remember that because it has an effect. Remember our conversion. But another thing he says in verse 6, going on, he says, "And for this reason I remind you, because of your conversion and who you are and your sincere faith, remind you to fan into flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands." He says, remember your contribution. Now Timothy, he says, this gift of God had been through the laying on of Paul's hands. They had commissioned him. In 1 Timothy 4:14, he told him, "Do not neglect the gift you have, which was given you by prophecy when the council of elders laid their hands upon you." Now, whether this was Timothy's a special gift for teaching that was only bestowed, or he had this gift, but the elders had, in a sense, commissioned him, and through the laying on of hands for service and ministry, some of that is nebulous as far as to what Paul means when he's saying this prophecy. But somebody knew something, that Timothy was gifted and God had set him apart. And they commissioned him. And he's saying, this gift which you have, he says, fan into flame. My daughter and I, one of the favorite things to do is, as the weather finally got cool enough, is to light a fire out in the backyard. You know, a little fire pit thing. And it's just, I was waiting. I mean, once it got below 80, I'm like, okay, you know, I want to light this thing, please. It's not 100, it's not even 90, it's cold. And but to come out and finally light this fire, and so I kind of get it going, and then go in and do some stuff. And I got like the worst firewood ever. I was in need, and some of the stuff I had was soaked. And so I was at Kroger, and I'm sure they'll have better firewood, so I don't want to ruin Kroger and their sales of firewood. But these, bundles of pine that they have, and so I'm like, sweet, that'll be quick. Get it and throw it in there. It's pine. It'll fire up quick and nice. And I don't know if this stuff had just been cut the day before or what. I'm trying to light it and initially kind of get this fire, and I go inside for a moment to get marshmallows and come out, and it's like out, and I'm having to blow and finally get it going. And it's like, a fire, even with good wood, at some point it just becomes coals. But you put air into it. You get a bellows or just full cheeks of air or something. Boom, you can fan it into flame, and then it's back going. And Paul says, fan into flame this gift. Because as time goes, you can sometimes be wondering, are you effective? Is God using you? Have you ever wondered that? Is God, what is my gift or my service? What is it that God would want me? And sometimes you're having that trouble finding that sweet spot. Where do I serve? How do I know what's God's will for me or where I should be serving? And or maybe you've seen it, but over time, things, pressures of life, just busyness of life or whatever, you wake up and you're like, what's happened to that? That fire of serving and being useful for God. Paul reminds Timothy, fan into flame. Keep that thing going. Remember your contribution, Timothy. Remember what it is that you have been set apart to do, that only you can do based on who you are. Now there's a lot of people here have different gifts. Some of you have a huge heart for the lost and an ability to take any conversation and spin it right into the gospel. And it's just a beautiful work of art. It's just a dance to watch somebody do that. Because some of us are just two left feet trying to get into the gospel and just, can't get it clear. Some of you have this capacity of mercy that you can come along, you can see where somebody's hurt, and you can come in and just kind of sweep up the pieces and put it back and say, I hear you. Some of you have an amazing ability to teach kids. Not anybody can teach Bible stories and biblical truths to kids to where then we can say, after church, go home and say, what did you learn today? And they know it because you're able to do that. And it's an ability God has helped you to do. Everybody has something, some even more. of ways you serve, God has gifted. Has that fire gotten to a point where it needs kindled afresh, fanned into flame? What is your contribution? Paul's telling Timothy, remember your conversion. Remember your contribution. Remember what it is that you can do. I remember thinking I was going to get it. I would have these discussions after I was growing and I was in high school. Well, my dad wasn't as excited about my faith as I was. And I think sometimes he was just playing devil's advocate. But the truth was, to that point, all he knew really was just a cultural Christianity. And anything beyond just going to church was getting weird. I had an older brother, two older brothers. The oldest was going on full-time staff with Campus Crusade for Christ. My other brother was in college serving in Young Life. And I was at home, kind of the boots on the ground, left at home, growing, and I would have these discussions, and it seemed like, man, and he wasn't happy, and he wasn't truly a believer yet. And it seemed that the more we prayed, the harder he was to live with. And my brothers had made a deal where we would pray every day for him. And we would pray every day for each other to pray for him. So when you know that you're responsible also to be praying for them to pray, it's kind of like, all right, oops, I'm letting them down if I don't. And so we prayed. And for 2 years, the more we prayed, the harder he was to live with. And I was like, Lord, is anything happening? And he was just getting miserable. And praying. I'm at home. I don't know if any of these discussions or anything that's going on is having any kind of fruit or whatever. But I'm seeing my brothers. Well, a guy at work invites my dad to go see Josh McDowell at this businessman's luncheon. My dad didn't want to go with him, but he asked my middle brother, hey, this thing, you want to go? So they go. And it's at that luncheon that my dad receives Christ. A few years later, I don't know if you've been in Denton long enough, you remember when Promise Keepers was here out at Fouts Field. My oldest brother, who at one point I think was termed a religious nut because of what he was doing, says, hey, let's all go, the four of us, men, and go to that. It was one of those bold steps. And we go. And it was a wonderful time that later on I got to hear my dad say, we'd been doing some work in the house after that, and he said, aside from having you boys, that was the greatest moment of my life when we huddled and prayed. And I thought about how miserable he had been and what God had done. And maybe there was some seeds or some sowing or watering, but all of us and others having this part that played. And when he was battling cancer, a few years later, he said, I don't know if I'm going to fight, but if it's the Lord's will, I'm ready. I thought, wow, if I just had any part at all in that, and I know my brothers did, they took the lead on certain things, but the hope of going, what is it? Who are you influencing? Who's in your life? God, fan in the flame, be a fire. Remember what it is that you can do in ministry. Remember your contribution. In verse 7, it says, remember your confidence. Verse 7, he says, for God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and self-control. How many of us live in fear? You think about sharing the gospel, and aside from being tongue-tied, you think, gosh, my coworker, is this going to damage that relationship? Or this friend of mine, is it going to be the end of that? Maybe I'll just kind of keep bringing up Christian things maybe, or, give them a coffee mug, or I don't know, whatever, But that boldness, you're kind of just still fearful. Or how about this? Holidays are coming up. How many of you are ready to have some Thanksgiving with unbelieving family? And it's always tense. You're like, man, we'll just keep it on the down low here, so get through it. Because whatever it is, our world, our culture, being PC, can't bring up this, can't bring up that. It's this thing of fear that can come in. And God says, God hasn't given us a spirit of fear, but of power, of love. And you know what's important about having love in there in that series? How many people have you seen, believers, who came forth with a lot of power but had no love? And they could share the gospel, but they had no love. What do you call that? Call it a jerk. There you go. It's power and love and self-control. Knowing how to control yourself, but being led by the Spirit. I went to China in 2001 to kind of scope out a trip for taking the youth group and taking some of our students over there. And a guy named Jimmy McQuinney had just moved over, and so he worked with this organization, and as far as China team was headed up by this guy named Tom Frakes. And so while we were there, I'm getting my circuits blown just being in a place that I had all these misconceptions about. But we head over to the university and going to visit this thing called English Corner, and it's where the students would gather around in this spot so they could practice English. And if there were native speakers, that was wonderful. Because if you're trying to learn your foreign language and you're speaking with other people who that's a foreign language, you're setting the bar really low and you never know if you're getting better. And so there was just a natural attraction. And so I'm in China, and did I even say that? And it's kind of thinking, this is my perspective of, okay, I'm a Christian, can I even be here? And I'm expecting, like Communist Party members behind every corner, watching me, and just, and we're sitting there, and so they're talking. Well, they start asking questions about holidays and, so Christmas and Easter and things, and those are very much tied to our faith, and so they keep asking more questions, and I'm kind of like, ugh. And all of a sudden I hear Tom Frakes, and he's got about 20 people around him, and he's full-fledged into the gospel. If it's a four-point outline, he's already on 3, and I'm like, whoa, keep it down, they're going to get you, and he's going. This guy was boldness in action. And not only there, but the whole ministry. He ended up getting kicked out of China. And you can say, well, that was foolish. Or was it? There were points that Lindsay and I were like, we'd rather get kicked out because we said too much and did too much than to not do anything and play it, because that's what they want if they're trying to just control. And it's a dance. You have to learn sometimes to lose a battle to win the war. But Tom Frakes showed me right then and there, whoa, man, I'm fearful. This guy's bold. But he was loving. They loved talking to him. And those conversations would lead to lunch appointments and things. And he could get into the gospel and share the love of Christ. And it was boldness with love. And so in light of this, Paul says in verse 8, therefore, do not be ashamed. Do not be ashamed of the testimony about our Lord, nor of me his prisoner, but share in suffering for the gospel by the power of God. And then he goes on into one of the longest run-on sentences ever. But therefore, do not be ashamed. Remember your conversion. Remember what it is that God did in you. the work that He did to transform you, the people who were in your life. Remember your contribution. Fan into flame the gift of God that has been in you, where you can serve. And remember your confidence. Remember, we've not been given a spirit of timidity, but one of power, of love, of self-discipline. Why did I choose this? One, it was on my heart because I need it. Like I said, I kind of identify more with Timothy than with Paul. And so it's good to hear from Paul, who this guy of boldness who's soon to be beheaded for his faith, as he challenges to remind, gosh, yes, no matter what goes on in this world, no matter who's in what office, what country, what rules, you can be in most extreme of a oppressive regime. You could be in a country that you thought was just so opposed. You could, or you can be in America. We don't get beheaded. We get laughed at. We get ridiculed. We might get some freedoms taken away. Who knows? We have not been given a spirit of timidity, but of power and love and self-discipline. Remember your conversion, your contribution, and your confidence.